In 1959, the United States Army sat down and wrote a plan to put soldiers on the moon, not to visit it, to live there. A permanent military base. 12 men buried beneath the lunar surface, running on nuclear power, ready to defend against an enemy that had not even reached space yet. This was a full decade before Neil Armstrong. It was before any human being had set foot up there at all. And stamped across the top of the report were 3 words the public was never meant to see: no public release. For years that file stayed locked away. And when it finally surfaced, it left people asking the same uneasy question: did America secretly build a base on the moon? The truth turns out to be stranger than the conspiracy. They did not hide a base up there. What they actually did was plan one in complete seriousness and get far closer to attempting it than almost anyone today realizes. This is the story of Project Horizon. To understand how a plan this wild ended up on a general's desk, you have to go back to October 1957. That is when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, and the steady beeping of that little metal ball terrified Washington. For the first time, America was not out in front. The country that had built the atomic bomb was suddenly looking up at the sky, watching someone else's machine pass overhead every 90 minutes. The fear ran deep. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, what else could they put up there? Weapons? Soldiers? A stretch of high ground above the entire planet that no army on Earth could ever reach? In 1958, President Eisenhower signed the act that created NASA, a civilian space agency meant to keep exploration peaceful and open. But the military was not about to sit this one out. And inside the United States Army, a group of engineers started asking a question that sounds like pure science fiction. If we have to claim space before the Soviets do, why stop at orbit? Why not take the moon itself? On March 20th, 1959, that question turned into an order. Lieutenant General Arthur Trudeau, the Army's Chief of Research and Development, signed a directive launching a study into building a manned station on the moon by 1966. And the directive came with a clear warning. Until the results reached the Secretary of Defense, nobody was to talk about it. No contact outside the Army, no statements to the press. This was to stay quiet. To run the study, the Army turned to the most famous rocket man alive. Wernher von Braun, the German engineer who had built Hitler's V-2 rockets and then been brought to America to build its missiles, was now working out of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency in Huntsville, Alabama. Von Braun handed the project to one of his planners, a young engineer named Heinz Hermann Koelle, and gave him roughly 90 days to answer one question. Could the United States actually put a permanent manned military base on the moon? Koelle and his team did not come back with a polite no. They came back with a blueprint. And the blueprint is where this story stops sounding like history and starts sounding like a movie. The report opened with a single line that still lands like a punch. There is a requirement for a manned military outpost on the moon. Not a hope, not a someday idea. A requirement. Here is what they wanted to build. The first 2 men would land in 1965. Sit with that for a second. That is 4 years before Apollo 11. By the end of 1966, the outpost would house 12 men, living in cylindrical modules buried under the lunar soil to shield them from radiation and the brutal cold. Power would come from nuclear reactors, 2 of them during the construction phase, and 4 once the base was finished. And getting all of that up there would take a wall of fire. The plan called for 61 launches of the Saturn I rocket and 88 launches of the larger Saturn II, just to deliver the base by late 1966. Then, in the first year of operation alone, 64 more launches to keep it supplied. The price tag came to around $6 billion in 1959 money. They even picked out the real estate. The engineers studied the near side of the moon, focusing on a band within about 20 degrees of the lunar center so the base could keep a clean line of sight back to Earth. Among the candidate spots were the region known as Sinus Aestuum and the edge of Mare Imbrium. They were choosing the address for a moon base before they had a single human being to send there. So what was all of it for? Why does an army need a fortress in the sky? The report didn't hide its reasons. From the moon, you could watch the entire Earth and everything moving through the space around it. You could relay communications, you could hold the high ground of the solar system. And if it ever came to that, you could run military operations straight from the surface. The document even floated the idea of a single unified space command. The moon, in other words, as a watchtower you could see the whole world from. Now here is where you have to be careful, because this is the exact point where the story gets twisted online. When people hear the phrase secret military moon base plan, their brain quietly drops one word: plan. And suddenly the story morphs into America secretly built a base on the moon and covered it up. That's not what the documents show. There is a world of difference between a secret plan and a secretly built base. And Project Horizon was the first one, not the second. Yes, the early study was kept quiet. Yes, the report literally used the words manned military outpost. So anyone who tells you the Pentagon never seriously considered a moon base is simply wrong. They considered it carefully enough to draw the floor plan. But the same paper trail that proves they planned it also proves what happened next. And what happened to Project Horizon wasn't a cover-up. It was a slow, quiet death by paperwork. Because while von Braun's team was dreaming up lunar fortresses, the ground was already shifting under their feet. America had decided that space was going to be civilian, not military. NASA was up and running. In 1960, the Army's entire rocket operation, von Braun, Coel, and all of them, was lifted out of the military and handed to NASA, where it became the Marshall Space Flight Center. The very people who wrote Project Horizon basically changed employers. The Army's own history is blunt about it. The project never made it past the feasibility stage. The report got steered toward a more civilian mission and was passed up the chain to NASA through the Secretary of Defense in the spring of 1960. The moon was no longer the Army's job. It belonged to NASA now. And honestly, the numbers tell you why it had to go that way. Look at what Project Horizon was promising against what actually happened. They wanted boots on the moon in 1965. In reality, the first humans did not land until July of 1969, with Apollo 11. The giant Saturn V rocket that finally made the trip possible did not even fly until 1967. And the Apollo program ended up costing more than $25 billion. Project Horizon believed it could build a manned military base for $6 billion years earlier using rockets that barely existed yet. It was less a serious budget than a gorgeous fantasy in a binder. So if there's no base up there, what is actually left of all this? Three things. The first is a piece of law. In 1967, the major spacefaring nations signed the Outer Space Treaty, and it specifically banned military bases, fortifications, and weapons tests on the moon and other worlds. The exact thing Project Horizon imagined became illegal under international law. Anyone claiming there's a secret armed base up there today isn't only fighting the evidence, they're fighting a treaty that almost the entire world signed. The second thing is the surface itself. Since 2009, NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter has been photographing the moon in extraordinary detail, sharp enough to pick out the leftover hardware from the Apollo landings. And across all of those public images, there is no verified sign of a large secret American base from the 1960s. A structure that size, sitting in well-mapped territory, should be visible. The open data simply doesn't show one. That's not absolute proof of a negative, but it's about as close as the evidence can take us. And the third thing left behind is the document. Because that's the real twist in this whole story. The fantasy of a hidden moon base is everywhere online. But the genuinely unsettling part of Project Horizon isn't a myth at all. The sober, stamped, signed reality sitting in the archives is wilder than the myth ever managed to be. The United States Army really did sit in a room in 1959 and decide it needed soldiers on the moon. They wrote it down. They priced it out. They chose the landing site. And then the world moved on, and the whole thing slid quietly into a filing cabinet, where it waited decades for someone to pull it back out. Project Horizon never put a single boot on the moon. But it tells you something most space documentaries never quite admit. The race to the moon was never purely about science or wonder. From the very beginning, before the first footprint, before the flag, there were people looking up at that gray rock and seeing high ground. A position to hold. The most haunting secrets aren't always about the things that happened. Sometimes they're about how close we came to a completely different version of history. If you found this as fascinating as I did, do me one favor and hit subscribe. This channel digs up the real documents behind the stories everyone thinks they already know, and there is a lot more buried where this came from.